Hi, everyone. So I want to take a little time to go over the lesson on integrating sources with you. This is a very important, very useful lesson because even though students understand that when they write a research paper, they have to include source information, they don't always understand how, how to use source material in different ways, how to actually get the information into the paragraph in a way that is smooth, that flows, and still remains a part of your own line of thought. So we are going to look at how we can use summary, and we're going to look at some tips for producing a good summary. We're going to look at how you can use paraphrase. We're going to learn a 4-step process for creating proper paraphrases. And then we're going to look at how you can use direct quote, when you should use direct quote, and how you can integrate someone else's word for word idea into your sentence, your paragraph. Okay, so let's go ahead and pull up our PowerPoint here. Okay. So how to use source material, integrating sources, right? So we know that in a research paper, knowing how to effectively use sources is extremely important. Being able to effectively use your source material helps you bolster your point, your idea with credibility or the reputation of your source. It helps identify the other opinions and theories and personal explanations that are out there. It can help present assertion of facts that are open to dispute. Source material can help present statistics. It also helps establish your ethos as a good, reliable scholar, that you have looked at all of the information out there on your topic, and that you have a good understanding of it, and that what you are presenting in your paper is credible and supported by other credible sources. It also lets your reader know where to find information on your topic, right? And we looked at how your citation matches up with your reference entry, so that way your reader can go to your reference entry, see all of the information they need to then go find that source and read it for themselves, right? So we know we have to use source material for these reasons, but we don't always know the best way to get that information into our essay. So there are 3 ways that you can incorporate source material into your research paper. We're going to look at each one closely, but first we need to understand what the difference is among all 3. First, we have summary. It is a relatively brief, objective account in your own words of the main ideas of an entire source or a section of a source. A summary is going to only discuss the overall main ideas of the source. It is not going to really get into a lot of the details from the source. If you are hoping to touch on some of the specific details in that source, then summary is probably not the way to go. But it is possible that you look at a website, for instance, and a page on that website, and there's no like one significant section that really is like, that's what I'm going to use in my paper. It's really more like overall, the information that page presented is something that you want to mention in your paper. Then summary is the way you're going to do it. But you're only capturing the overall main ideas, not the specific details. It is objective, meaning you're not analyzing it, you're not critiquing it, you're not disagreeing with it or agreeing with it. You are simply providing an objective overview of that source's main idea. You do need to put it in your own words. A summary will be totally your own words capturing the main ideas from that source. A paraphrase is also totally in your own words, but it's also the structure. You don't just change the words, you change the structure, the organization of the ideas, and we're going to look closely at that. But a paraphrase will bring in those specific details from the source. It's usually going to be a smaller section of your source that you are wanting to focus on, and that's why a paraphrase focuses on the detail, because it's just a small section. A quote, a direct quote, is when you use the exact words of a source, word for word. Like you lifted it straight from the source and put it in your paragraph, word for word. And it's a quote, so it has to be in quotation marks. That's what lets your reader know that you took that information word for word from the source and that you didn't paraphrase it in your own words, right? You can use all three of these in a research paper, right? You will want to use summary and paraphrase the most. You want to use direct quotes sparingly, and for the reasons that were mentioned under the quotation restraint section on slide 19 of the drafting research papers lesson that came right before this lesson. So you want to make sure that if you're using a direct quote, taking something word for word from the source and putting it in quotation marks, that you're doing that because it was perfectly worded. There's just no other way to restate that idea. Or it's a complex idea that you need to show the reader exactly how it appeared in the source and then explain it. Very rarely, with the topics that you've been given to choose from, and the sources that I know are out there, the ones that come up the most, there is very rarely a need to use a direct quote. There's no need for it. And if you're only using direct quotes, it's a sign to your reader that you don't fully understand the information. Because if you're able to provide a summary or a paraphrase of that information, it indicates that you have understood that information so well that you can say the same thing that the source did, but in a different way, in your own words. If you're constantly using direct quote, you run the risk of either truly not understanding what the information means, or indicating to your reader, making your reader think that you don't really understand what you're talking about. So you really want to limit the amount of direct quoting that you use in your paper. Go for summary and paraphrase most. Okay. To write a summary or paraphrase, the first thing you want to do is read and then reread your source until you fully understand exactly what it is saying. Write down, take some notes maybe, either on a separate piece of paper or like in the margins if it's something that you've printed off. Write down relevant information, take notes, right? If you're taking notes, you're already starting to think about things and understand them and comprehend them. And you might, at this point, when you're taking your notes, some of the wording and phrasing and the language is still going to be very similar to what the original source says. When it comes time to put that in your paper, though, you can't do that. None of the wording, none of the language, none of the structure can be similar. If your summary or paraphrase is still too close to the original, it's still considered plagiarism. So how do we get from reading and taking notes that still might be very similar to the original? How do we get from that to including a summary or paraphrase that is acceptable? Well, next thing you're going to do is, without looking at the source or your notes, rewrite the information in your own words, create your own passage that can become a coherent part of your paper that's written in your style, not the language and style used by the original author. You're going to use their idea, the information they provided, but you're going to say it in your own way. That's how you ensure that what appears in your essay is not going to be plagiarism. So, remember, you're not going to include your own ideas or commentary in the summary or paraphrase. It's only information from the source. You have to introduce or signal a summary or paraphrase, and we're going to look a little more at that. But basically, it's not just, you kind of lead into it, all right? You're going to provide a citation for that source immediately after the summary or paraphrase, not later in the paragraph. As soon as you get finished typing those sentences, that is the summary or that is the paraphrase, the information from the source, boom, parentheses with your citation, right? You got to have the citation so that you're not committing plagiarism, because even though you're putting everything in your own words, those ideas came from the original author. When we provide a citation, we are not just saying these words came from this source. We're saying these ideas came from this source as well. You have to have the citation so that it's not plagiarism. It comes right after the summary or paraphrase so that your reader doesn't become confused as to what information came from the source and what information came from you, your own ideas. So you make it clear that you are about to discuss something from your source. That's the signal. And then you provide that information from the source. Then you provide the citation so that your reader understands that's the information that came from the source that you put in your own words. So the ideas came from that source. And then you move on to follow up on that source information, which is the last thing that you do here. You have to give your own ideas that show the significance of that summary or paraphrase, the information that you're including from your source. You have to then show the reader why it was included in the first place. How does that information from that article even connect? How does it relate to the point you're making in that paragraph? You have to follow up, right? Anytime you use source material, you should be following up on it, whether it's a summary, a paraphrase, or a direct quote. You always follow up. You don't let the source information stand on its own. You don't force your reader to figure out why you mentioned that information in the first place. That's your job. You're the one who's writing this paper. You're the one who's making a main point in this particular section of the paper. You're the one who has introduced that main point, started talking about that main point. You're the one who chose this specific source material to help support that main point. Now it's your job to explain how it supports your main point. How does it connect back? You have to do that. Okay? All right, so we're going to look first at summary and practice that a little bit. Okay? There's a handout linked under the video called Halloween Essay. We're going to read that, and then we're going to see how you can summarize that essay and use it as source information in a paragraph of a paper, right? So, take a look here at the essay, okay? All right, it's written by John Smith, October 22nd, 2014. The title of it is John Carpenter's Halloween. For nearly a century, horror movies have been shocking and scaring audiences across the globe, from the universal monster movies of the early 1940s to the current remakes and unoriginal horror films of today. There's no choice but to look back to find the greatest of them all. John Carpenter's Halloween, 1978, is the only one that truly stands out. With the use of great acting, suspense, a chilling musical score, and one hell of an antagonist, Halloween is undoubtedly the greatest horror movie yet. The first aspect of Halloween that makes it such a terrific film is the acting. This cinematic powerhouse was first conceived by a pair of college students by the names of John Carpenter and Deborah Hill. Through the process of networking, they were able to gain a budget of $300,000 thanks to Mustafa Akkad. All they needed next was actors. Enter Jamie Lee Curtis. Chosen because her mother was the lead actress in Psycho, Curtis found herself in the leading role of Laurie Strode. Throughout the film, Strode is your basic Girl Scout. She's the innocent and sweet girl next door, oblivious to the fact that an escaped psychopath is stalking her. The acting on Curtis's behalf was stunning. For example, oftentimes in the film, she spots Michael Myers watching her and says nothing. The subtlety in her reaction here is a big part of the scare. We don't know what she is thinking or feeling and forces us to think and feel for her. The best acting, however, goes to Donald Pleasence for his portrayal of Dr. Sam Loomis. Loomis is a psychologist who attempts to treat Michael Myers for 15 years until Myers escapes. The way Pleasence handles this character is simply perfection. He embodies it. In a way, Loomis appears to be just as crazy as Michael Myers. In one memorable scene, Loomis shoots Myers out of a two-story building only to find the body is missing moments later. The reaction here is extremely well done by Pleasence. He asked Carpenter if he should act like he knew it would happen or that he was shocked. Carpenter told him to play both reactions, and Pleasence did perfectly. In addition to superb acting, another key factor to the greatness of Halloween is suspense. The kills throughout the movie come slow and give the viewer time to wonder where the killer is and when he'll pop out. When he does finally show up, the scare is all the more terrifying. The scariest and most suspenseful scene is when the character Annie gets in her car without realizing Myers is in the back seat. The viewer is focused on Annie for nearly 3 minutes until she gets in the car. When she finally does get in, Myers jumps from the back seat and slits her throat. This scare by itself was pretty good, but what really tipped it over the edge was the stinger. A stinger, a term coined by John Carpenter, is a musical note timed perfectly to the appearance of the killer. Without the stinger, this scene would probably just be your average jump scare, which represents the rest of the picture on a smaller scale. The musical score for the picture is what made the movie more than just your average scare. Before John Carpenter composed and added the haunting musical numbers throughout the film, he test screened it. The audience of the test screening found the movie to be scary at times, but not exactly terrifying. It was at this point the music was added and the film was rescreened. This time around, most viewers of the focus group found themselves covering their ears in fear. It shows how great the musical score is. Never had an audience covered their ears during a horror movie. Yet, even with the addition of a great musical score, no horror movie can ever be a good horror movie without an outstanding antagonist, and Halloween has the best antagonist in Michael Myers. The silence and calmness of this villain added to his terror tenfold. He did not chase victims, he stalked them, and the audience was along for the ride. His mask is undoubtedly the scariest part about him because the blank, pale, emotionless mask enabled audiences to cast their own personal fears on him. What can be more terrifying than one's own imagination? And keep in mind that this film was released in 1978 and predates any of the well-known slashers like Jason, Freddy, and Chucky. This was the first time audiences saw a seemingly normal villain who was shot 6 times and did not die. In a sense, Michael Myers was a trailblazer. With the aid of the aforementioned aspects, Halloween has stood the test of time and proved to be a great movie. The stellar cast, hauntingly suspenseful scenes and music, and the man himself, Michael Myers, came together in perfect unison to give us an outstanding movie. Several sequels, a remake, and a sequel to the remake all serve as added proof that there will never be another horror film quite as good as John Carpenter's Halloween. Okay, so I have this essay/article that is all about the greatness of Halloween, the movie. And we're going to pretend like we are writing an essay that has something to do with horror movies, right? How could we summarize the main ideas of that whole essay to use as source material in our essay? Okay. So we have a paragraph here from an essay, and it looks like this essay is really looking at popular scary movies that get more credit than they deserve, that maybe aren't quite as good as people think they are, right? And this particular paragraph is going to talk about how Halloween is one of those movies. So we have our transitional topic sentence here in yellow. Another fan favorite slasher film that gets more praise than it should is John Carpenter's 1978 classic, Halloween. And then we build on that. This film inevitably shows up on any kind of best horror films list, and though it might not deserve the top spot, there is no denying the appeal of this movie. And we get source material. As explained in the article John Carpenter's Halloween, the movie by the same name, many fans are drawn in by several defining factors. The article showcases the frightening nature of Michael Myers as the villain, paying special homage to his creepy faceless mask, along with the now classic stinger that Carpenter created to add terror through the use of simple musical notes. The article also points out the film's use of jump scares and the undeniable acting chops of both Jamie Lee Curtis and Donald Pleasence. And then we get our citation. So this whole part in blue is just a summary of the main points from that essay we just read. They put it in their own words. They highlighted the main points, didn't really worry about a whole lot of the specific details, right? And I now have a pretty good idea of what that essay focused on. I'd have to read it myself to know the exact examples that are being used and explained, but I know that that essay is going to be about this movie and why it's so good. In particular, the villain, the music, the scene, the suspense scenes, and the acting. Right? Now, in the essay, the author discussed those in the opposite order, but for the summary, we changed up the order so that we weren't at risk of being too close to the original source material. How did we do this? Well, again, we read the essay and we reread it. We took notes, made sure we understood it, and then we put all that aside. And without looking at anything, just based on our memory and our understanding of the essay, we wrote the summary, right? In that essay, the author states that Halloween is a great movie because of the villain, right? Especially his mask, the use of the stinger, the musical note, the use of jump scares, and the great acting. And look at everything here in pink. Follows up on the summary, explains it, connects it. And while Smith makes a strong argument in favor of Halloween being the best horror movie ever made, it is his explanation of Michael Myers that touches on the exact reason why this movie really isn't as good as many believe it to be. Sure, the creepy mask might invoke terror in some viewers, but other viewers struggle to enjoy this film because that villain has no real backstory. Why is Michael Myers the way he is? How does he target his victims? Where's the personal history that might help explain how he became Michael Myers? Yes, we get bits of flashbacks here and there, but we never gain a full understanding of this villain, which is even more frustrating considering one of the most memorable characters in the movie is the therapist who treated Myers for 15 years. You'd think we would hear more about this villain and everything Dr. Loomis had learned about his patient. It's possible that this lack of information, in addition to the creepy mask, is part of the reason why many viewers fear Myers, because they don't understand him. But the lack of character development with this villain can't be ignored. So does Halloween deserve to be on those lists for best horror films where it so often appears? Perhaps. However, there are flaws with this film, and that leaves us still searching for what can truly be considered the greatest scary movie of all time. Perhaps we should turn our attention away from slasher films, though, and look at another subgenre of horror films. Right? So everything here in pink is it now we understand why they summarized that source in the first place, right? They were going to argue against it, right? And you're not necessarily arguing anything in your research paper, but there has to be a reason why you chose the specific source information that you did. So whether this part in blue is a summary, a paraphrase, or a direct quote, this part in pink still needs to be there. Okay? But you can see how they did summarize that essay, right? They hit the main points. They encapsulated the main overall points of that essay and really didn't get into any of the specific details. That's what a summary should do. All right. So obviously, you need to practice your skills at creating a summary. You need to practice your skills at producing a good paraphrase. And that's the one that students struggle with the most. Because if you're taking a whole source and summarizing just the main points of that source, just the overall main ideas, you are less likely to copy anything straight from the source because you're having to take all of this information and boil it down into one small paragraph, one, just a handful of sentences that captures all of that. So you're not as likely to accidentally copy something. With a paraphrase, it's a smaller amount of source material, and it becomes much more likely that you will accidentally plagiarize that material. Because a lot of students understand, a paraphrase is taking that information and changing it a little bit. So they go in and they change a few words. Maybe they get out their thesaurus and they look for synonyms of some of the words in the original. And they take those words out and replace them with the synonyms and think they're done. No. Some students know that they need to change the wording completely. So they do that. But then they still follow the same exact organization, the same pattern, the same structure that the original source material followed. That's still plagiarism. It's tougher to paraphrase correctly, but once you know how, it's not as difficult as it seems, and it's still the way you want to go almost all the time. You're not going to always want to summarize a whole big section of your source. And we already know that you have to limit the amount of direct quotes you use because you should be using word for word things sparingly, only when absolutely necessary. And it's often never necessary. So if paraphrase is where you want to live, you got to learn the tips for doing it correctly because it's the easiest to plagiarize unintentionally. So I have a process here for you, a 4-step process that once you understand what the process is really all about, it makes creating a good paraphrase, an acceptable paraphrase, so much easier. Okay, so let's look. Step 1, translate, right? Translate the passage into your own words. Do not simply use a thesaurus. State the whole idea the way you would state it. So I have an example here. We have our original source material, and it's the start of getting for the day. 407 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. So if we're going to use that information in our source, and we're going to paraphrase it, because it's a very short, it's one sentence, so there's no way to summarize it. Summarizing it would be a paraphrase. We don't want to direct quote it. because we know we should do that only when absolutely needed. We know we need to paraphrase. We got to put the whole thing in our own words. Say the same thing in a completely different way. Step one of that is translate. So 87 years ago, 87 years ago. Our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation. Our ancestors created the United States of America, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal, founded on the ideals of freedom and equality. So when we look at that first sentence of the Gettysburg Address, if we're going to put that in our own words, what does that mean? 87 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Well, that's basically saying 87 years ago, our ancestors created the United States of America, founded on the ideals of freedom and equality. All right, step one, check. Step two is to flip it. This is the step students miss. Don't skip step two. Flip the paraphrase. Move the beginning to the end and the end to the beginning and create a whole new structure. So our translation in step one was 87 years ago, our ancestors created the United States of America, founded on the ideals of freedom and equality. So we're going to flip it. Freedom and equality are the ideals on which the United States of America was founded by our ancestors 87 years ago. Flip it. Now we have different wording and we have different structure and organization, right? The only thing about this paraphrase right here that resembles the original is the information. That's what a paraphrase is, saying the same thing in a completely different way. So what we have here in the flipped version after we've done step two, it says the same thing that the original did, but in a totally different way. Step one, translate. Step two, flip. You've taken care of one element of possible plagiarism. Okay. Step three is the signal phrase, right? So this introduces the source, before the paraphrase or before the quote or summary. It lets the reader know that you are about to provide information from a source. So we have our flipped version, right? This was what we ended up with after step two. Freedom and equality are the ideals on which the United States of America was founded by our ancestors 87 years ago. We're going to add in a signal. This is going to appear in one of our paragraphs. So we've already started the paragraph. We're already in the paragraph. This is just how we're leading up to that source material. When Abraham Lincoln spoke at the 1963 dedication of the cemetery for Union soldiers at Gettysburg, he began by saying that freedom and equality are the ideals on which the United States of America has been founded by the listener's ancestors 87 years before. We signaled it. We worked up to the source material. We didn't just plunk it. Then step four is citation and commentary. Citation, of course, is the second step in making sure you are not accidentally committing plagiarism. With a paraphrase, the first step is making sure you translate and flip. With any source, the other step is the citation. But don't forget the commentary, following up on it. All right, so this is what we had after step three, adding in our signal phrase. When Abraham Lincoln spoke at the 1863 dedication of a cemetery for Union soldiers at Gettysburg, he began by saying that freedom and equality are the ideals on which the United States of America had been founded by the listener's ancestors 87 years before. Here's our citation, and then our commentary. Lincoln may have been right about our country's noble beginnings, but it is clear that the ideals of freedom and equality have not yet come to fruition in the United States. So why were we even including this information? We've explained it to our reader now. So, 4 steps. Translate, flip, signal, cite, and commentary. Right? It's pretty easy when you understand what each step encompasses. Translating it, putting in your own words. Flipping it, changing the order up so that the structure of your paraphrase is not like the structure of the original source. Signal it. Make sure that you are leading into the source information, that your reader understands you are about to provide information from a source. And then cite it and comment on it. We've already looked at the essay on Halloween to see how it could be used as a summary of source information. But let's look at how it can be used as paraphrase. So remember, a paraphrase is not seeking to just cover the main ideas. A paraphrase typically focuses on a small section of the text, and we're looking at the details in a paraphrase. So the idea is to say the same thing as the original source, but in a totally different way. Translate, flip, signal, cite, and comment. Okay? Let's look at how part of that Halloween essay could be used as a paraphrase. All right, so this is all about villains of horror movies, right? So if you remember that essay on Halloween, there was one section, the 4th main point was all about the villain. It was all about how Michael Myers is one of the best villains in horror movies. So we are writing a paper about the best villains in horror movies. So we have to talk about Michael Myers. Perhaps one of the best villains in all of horror film history is Michael Myers from John Carpenter's 1978 Halloween. That was our transitional topic sentence. Now we're going to build on that and develop it more. This film is always considered a classic, and there are viewers who still think Michael Myers is the most terrifying villain they have ever watched on screen, which is an impressive feat considering how many well-known villains have come after Myers. As John Smith asserts, Michael Myers was a villain ahead of his time. The white mask Myers wears forces viewers to project their own version of scary onto this character, and his slow, calculated movements and quiet demeanor also contribute to the fear many viewers experience. Okay? He asserts that Michael Myers was a villain ahead of his time. The white mask forces viewers to project their own version of scary onto him, and that his slow, calculated movements and quiet demeanor also contribute to the fear. Let's go back real quick and look at that section of the essay to see how that paraphrase is created. Okay, so this is the section on Michael Myers. Even with the addition of the great musical score, no horror movie can ever be a good horror movie without an outstanding antagonist, and Halloween has the best antagonist in Michael Myers. The silence and calmness of this villain added to his terror tenfold. He did not chase victims, he stalked them, and the audience was along for the ride. So in the essay, the author talks about his demeanor and slow movement first. Then his mask is undoubtedly the scariest part about him because the blank, pale, emotionless mask enabled audiences to cast their own personal fears on him. What can be more terrifying than one's own imagination? They talked about the mask second. And keep in mind that this film was released in 1978 and predates any of the well-known slashers like Jason, Freddy, and Chuck. This was the first time audiences saw a seemingly normal villain who was shot 6 times and did not die. In a sense, Michael Myers was a trailblazer ahead of his time. So, in this essay, when the author of this essay paraphrased the Halloween material, they start off with how Myers was a villain ahead of his time. In the essay, John Smith used the term trailblazer, right? But we've translated and we've flipped, right? We put all of that information into our own words and then flipped everything so that we're not using the same structure either. But we still provided the same general information that the original essay provided. We just did it in a completely new way. We provided our citation, and now in purple is the commentary. Indeed, when you look at other masked villains, such as Jason Voorhees, Ghostface, and Jigsaw, it's clear there is something unique about Michael Myers. Probably needed to follow up a little bit more. That's okay. Still a great example of a paraphrase. So don't forget that 4-step process. Translate, flip, signal, citation, and commentary. If you follow that 4-step process, you can create acceptable paraphrases every time, and then you won't be overusing these direct quotes that we're about to talk about. But sometimes you will want to use a direct quote, so we need to learn how to do that the right way. All right, so remember specific reasons why you should use a direct quote. The author has made a point so clearly and concisely that it cannot be expressed more clearly and concisely. Like, if you tried to mess with how it was originally worded, you would completely mess it up and make it even more complicated and harder to understand. Again, with the topics that you are given to choose from and the sources that I know are out there that students tend to use the most, you're not going to have this problem. There's not going to be much of anything in your source material that is stated so clearly and concisely that there's no better way to say it. It's not going to happen. Okay, if there is a certain phrase or sentence in the source that is particularly vivid or striking, right? It's just, then, you can maybe use the direct quote. If it is a complicated thought, a complicated idea, a complex idea that you need to, again, give word for word so that the reader can see exactly how it was worded and then you can explain it, then a direct quote would be acceptable. But again, probably not going to be the case for most of the sources that students typically use for these topics. There's very rarely a case when a direct quote needs to be used. But sometimes you do find a sentence in your source and you're like, oh man, that's great. Like that is a great way to word that idea. That's good. You might want to go ahead and provide it as a direct quote. Do it sparingly though. Use them sparingly. Get better at the 4-step process for creating paraphrases. That's where you should spend your time. And again, it's really not that difficult. If you think back to what we did in those 4 steps, it's not. If you understand the information, it's not hard to translate it and flip it. You got to signal it, cite it, and comment on it no matter how you're presenting it. Summary, paraphrase, direct quote. You have to signal, cite, and comment. So the parts of that, those parts of the 4-step process, you got to do that no matter what. So really, the paraphrasing is, where the crux of it is translation and flipping. Right? So get better at that. Use direct quotes sparingly. Do not let direct quotes speak for themselves. Again, no matter what kind of source material you're using or how you're using it, you have to follow up on it. You have to make sure to provide an analysis of the quote. You have to show your readers that you understand the information in the quote and how it relates to your ideas. You have to sort of unpack the quote, right? And you don't have, let's say there's like a section of your source, like a paragraph, a small paragraph in your source, and there's like things in like 3 different sentences that you think need to be provided word for word. But not necessarily all three sentences from start to finish. You're like, I don't need all three sentences from start to finish, one right after another. I just need this section of the first sentence, and this section of the next sentence, and this section of the last sentence. There's a way to do that too, without bogging the paragraph down with 3 full sentences of direct quotes. Because more than likely, you don't need every single verb of all 3 sentences. There's a way to extract the parts of the passage that need to be quoted and integrate those into the text. Okay. So, first thing you want to do is make sure that you that your signal isn't wordy or awkward. We have this original here that says, in Simone de Beauvoir's 2014 article, The Coming of Age, on page 65, she states, the decrepitude accompanying old age is in complete conflict with the manly or womanly ideal cherished by the young and fully grown. That was a really wordy way to introduce that quote. In Simone de Beauvoir's 2014 article, The Coming of Age, on page 65, she states, we don't need all of that. Make it less wordy. In The Coming of Age, Simone de Beauvoir contends that the decrepitude accompanying old age is in complete conflict with the manly or womanly ideal cherished by the young and fully grown, end quote, citation 2014. We don't need all of that information to introduce the quote. All we really need is to know who said it and then the citation. We don't even need to know who said it. You'll provide that in the citation. All we really need to know is that it does come from the source. We don't have to have every bit of information in the signal. That's what the citation is for. Remember, I don't need to know that it's on page 65. I don't need to know in the signal that it's from 2014, but you're going to give me that in the citation. I don't need it to bog down the beginning of the sentence. You know, I don't always need the author's name mentioned in the signal, because if you don't mention it in the signal, you're going to put it in the citation. So I'm going to get it there. I don't always need to know the title of the article, because, you know, unless it's super relevant to the point you're making. But if it's not, then just give me the quote with the citation. And if I want to see who said it in what article, on what page, I can go to your reference entry and find it. You know, you don't have to create these super long, awkward, wordy signals that crams in all of the source information before you actually get to the source information, right? Remember what your citations are there for. Okay. Choose your signal phrase or your verb carefully, right? You could say that such and such author states, they, you know, or they remark, they suggest. Those are neutral verbs. It basically, those types of verbs are saying that the author of the original source was simply presenting information. Now, if the author of the original source was making some type of argument or criticism, then you would say that, you know, such and such author claims, such and such author replies, admits, protests, right? Most of the time for this research paper from my class, you're going to be up here with the neutral verbs because you're not writing an argumentative paper. And so your sources really shouldn't be super argumentative in nature either. They should be more informative. Okay. You can combine quotes, direct quotes, with paraphrase or analysis. So we have this original here that says, Tanya Midlesky suggests that if television is considered by some to be a vast wasteland, soap operas are thought to be the least nourishing spot in the desert. citation. How could we, that's a long quote. We gave a really long direct quote there. What can we do to kind of pare that down so that it's more us and less source? In her critique of soap operas, Tanya Modlewski argues that some view television as, quote, a vast wasteland, end quote, and soap operas as, quote, the least nourishing spot in the desert. So, like, when we look up at this original quote, the best part of it is how she calls television a vast wasteland and how she could call soap operas the least nourishing spot in the desert. That's why we're wanting to use the direct quote in the first place, is because she has a very witty, two very witty phrases for television and soap operas, respectively. We want to use that. We want to show that. It's funny. But we don't need the whole thing. So we took some paraphrase liberties as well, and then simply quoted the exact phrases that we wanted to include word for word. Right? You can only use a few words if you want. You don't have, again, it doesn't have to be a full sentence. It could just be a few words. So here's the original. A recent study of student plagiarism found that plagiarism is often a, quote, matter of confusion rather than deception, end quote. Right? How about, as William Neal suggests, some humans have a, quote, moral deafness, end quote, which is never punctured no matter what the moral treatment. So all we really needed of our quote here in this is just moral deafness. Whatever sentence that appears in the original source, we didn't need the rest of it. All we needed was that term, moral deafness. So that's what we put in quotes. We still gave our citation though, right? We still signaled it. Okay. If your quotations are less than 4 lines long, which they should be, place them in your text and enclose them with quotation marks. Quotation mark. Anything word for word in quotation mark. Also gets a citation. Just because you put it in quotes doesn't mean you don't have to give the citation. Citation is required every single time you use source material, no matter what. The quotations are needed anytime it's word for word from the source. But you still need a citation. Use ellipses if you want to, like the beginning of a sentence is worth quoting, but not the middle. But then you want something at the end of it too, right? So, example, even to take drugs once or twice, Diamond writes, I must be strong enough to get past, ... the misery of my first hangover. Whatever happened in between here, where these ... are, that wasn't relevant to the point we wanted to make, so we just left it out. As long as it doesn't change the meaning of what the author was saying in that sentence or in that passage, you can do this. Quote what's needed. Leave out the rest. Still provide the citation. All right. So we're going to look again at our Halloween essay and see how we could use something from that as a direct quote source material. All right. So again, we're going back to Michael Myers being the villain. And if you remember in the paraphrase, we paraphrased the examples that John Smith used about Michael Myers being the best antagonist. So his movement and how he stalked his victims, his mask, and how he was a trailblazer. We paraphrased that. This time around, we're going to be focusing on using a direct quote instead. Would we really need to direct quote that article? No. That essay, nothing in that essay is so perfectly worded or so complex in thought that we would need to do a direct quote. But for the sake of using the same essay that we're already familiar with, instead of something else entirely, we're going to show how you can use a direct quote instead of the paraphrase. The rest of this paragraph is all the same. All we've done is changed what's in blue from a paraphrase to a direct quote. And it's a direct quote that starts with one section and then leaves out something in the middle and then picks up at the end. So, perhaps one of the best villains in all of horror film history is Michael Myers from John Carpenter's 1978 Halloween. This film is always considered a classic, and there are viewers who still think Michael Myers is the most terrifying villain they have ever watched on screen, which is an impressive feat considering how many well-known villains have come after Myers. As John Smith asserts, Michael Myers was a villain ahead of his time because, quote, he did not chase his victims, he stalked him, ... The blank, pale, emotionless mask enabled audiences to cast their own personal fears on him. Citation. Indeed, when you look at other masked villains such as Jason Voorhees, Ghostface, and Jigsaw, it's clear there's something unique about Michael Myers. We needed to, this author, the student, needed to unpack this a little more, but you can still see how they took part of Smith's words. He did not chase his victims, he stalked them, and then didn't really need what came next. So he uses the ellipses to let us know that there's, in the original source, there's more here. And then we pick up back where we want word for word again. The blank, pale, emotionless mask enabled audiences to cast their own personal fears on him. Right? Lots of different ways you can use direct quote. It doesn't have to be full sentences. Right? Look at what is absolutely necessary to quote. All right, and then the last thing I want to kind of go over is, just a chart here for you to come back to with more verbs for your signal, right? So Smith accepts, or Smith considers, Smith explains, Smith rejects, Smith contracts, Smith adds, Smith maintains or suggests, right? These are all very common verbs that you can use to help in your signal as you are moving into the summary, paraphrase, or direct quote. And you want to make sure you're using one that makes sense. You don't want to say that the author is, denying something if they're not really denying something, right? You want to make sure that you are using a term that makes sense, but the list can help you. The chart can help you if you're struggling, like, okay, I seem to be using the same signal over and over again. I keep saying claims. I keep saying claims. Come here and look and see if there's other verbs you can use that kind of mean the same thing, right? Shares, right? Acknowledges, concludes, describes, shows, right? There's other, there's a variety that you can choose from, right? But in review, 3 ways that you can incorporate source material into your paper. You will want to use summary and paraphrase the most. Probably paraphrase. You want to use direct quote sparingly and only if there is a valid reason for using the quote. For a summary, remember the goal is to capture the overall main ideas, not the details. You still provide a citation. For a paraphrase, remember the goal is to include the details, but presented in a totally different way. Use the 4-step process for creating a strong paraphrase, especially those first 2 steps. Translate, flip. It's the flip that students often forget, and that's what causes them to still get my notes. This is still too close to the original. It would be considered plagiarism. You need to work on this. If you are creating proper paraphrases the first time around and you're going through those 4 steps, you're not going to get notes like that from me on your rough draft. Bonus. Paraphrase, still provide a citation. Direct quote only when needed. Make sure that you're putting it in quotation marks, still providing the citation, right? You're going to use a signal phrase to introduce source material, whether summary, paraphrase, or direct quote. Use that signal. Always remember citation every single time, and follow up on your source information every time. Okay? All right, so that is it for integrating sources. You're going to get some practice in this week's homework. Make sure that you take that seriously, because I'll give you feedback on it. And if you don't do it right, you're going to get points taken off. You'll have the ability to make corrections, of course, but don't just look at it as a throwaway assignment. It's your chance to practice using summary. It's your chance to practice creating proper paraphrases. It's your chance to practice using a direct quote and signaling, introducing it, integrating it, citing it, following up on it, right? You're going to get to practice all of it. Take it seriously because it's practice. It's a good chance for you to know based on my feedback. All right, you didn't really get summary quite right, or your paraphrases were close, but it's still too close to the original. So this is what you need to do differently. It will help you know where your strengths already are and what you still need to work on and pay attention to as you are writing your rough draft next week. Okay. All right. So reach out if you have questions. Otherwise, you are free to go ahead and move on to lessons.